Our next item that we're going to look at is the fireball. And the fireball is a really fun weapon that Mario has that he uses to try to destroy the enemies inside of the game. So for the fireball, we'll take a look at our description. And the fireball is basically a game object that we're creating when the player gets the power up, which is the flower here. And when he presses a fire button, it's going to instantiate a projectile. And this projectile is going to move in the direction that we're facing. And it's going to bounce on the ground until it actually hits another object, or the lifespan, the time that it has, actually expires. So what kind of options are we going to need to create something like this? We see things where we need to be able to move this object, which means we need to be able to apply a force to this object or a velocity to this object. So we're going to have to deal with some sort of speed so we can control the speed of the object. We do want this object to actually bounce. So depending on the direction that we take with it, whether we're using a material physics, whether we're simply just calculating the distance up and down, or whether we use some sort of other physics object to make this ball bounce, we do need some sense of bounce height. How high are we going to allow this object to go up and down? And then we also need like a bounce direction. We need to find out, is it going up, is it going down, is it left, or is it right? The other thing we want to check for is we want to check for collisions inside of the environment to find out what is it that I hit and what do I need to do if I hit it. So this is the basic description for what we're going to do with our fireball. Let's go ahead and jump into our actual item inside of Unity and make sure that we have it set up properly. We may have to adjust the prefab inside of the file. So we'll take a look at it. We've got this prefab from the project dropped into our hierarchy, so we can take a look inside of our hierarchy. In the inspector, we should have it labeled prefab fireball. The tag is untagged in the default layer. If we go down, we can see that we have a rigid body assigned, and the rigid body is set up as is kinematic. The sphere collider is applied to it. We'll zoom in a little bit so we can see it. So we've got our sphere collider. The sphere collider is set to is trigger. We simply want to use it as a trigger to find out when it hits something. And below that we have our projectile fireball script assigned to it. There's nothing in there just yet. We are going to be getting to that in just a moment. The next part of our hierarchy here, this is our parent, this is our child. Inside of the parent we have a child, which is our fireball, which is loading up our sprite, our mesh renderer, and an audio source by default, and then our fireball image. And below that, we've got our fire trail, and this is where we've got our particle, our ellipsoid particle emitter, and our particle animator, and then lastly our particle renderer, and our projectile fireball material. So that is the basic setup of it. Make sure that yours is set up the same. And if yours is set up the same, then we can go ahead and get started with this one. We're going to start laying out the variables that we need to begin with and get those established first. And then we'll start moving into the functions to make it actually do something fun. So just like we said before, what we want to do is start off with something for controlling the speed. So let's just do a move speed. So we'll do a variable move speed, and this is going to be a float variable. And what do we want this to equal? Let's start off with something sort of slow. We'll start off with 1.0. And then we can move into a variable for our, let's say, our bounce up. One of the things we wanted to check on from our description, we want to be able to check for the direction of the ball. So we're going to just do a boolean, which allows us just to check for what direction are we bouncing. Are we bouncing down? Or are we bouncing up? So we'll do a bounce up. And we can start this one as false. That way we make sure that we're actually bouncing down when we get started. And then the next thing we want to look for is going to be a bounce height. In fact, we can actually set that one in between just on the inspector to look nice. So we'll do a bounce height. And the bounce height is how high do we want this object to actually bounce up into the air. So again, we're kind of guessing at numbers right here because we don't have a example to pull from just yet. So when you are guessing, kind of keep it small because we are dealing with a smaller image. We know how large these sizes are. We've dealt with that before. So we'll do something about, let's say, a 0.25. And then we can work with it from there. We need another variable to hold the lifespan of this object, so we can do a variable for lifespan. And lifespan can be, again, a float. And let's make our lifespan something like at least 2.02 seconds to make sure we have enough time to actually see it come out and do something with it. We can line up some of our code real quick. Let's go ahead and drop in some comments. Whoops. There we go. So the first thing we've got is the move speed, which is just set the speed of the projectile. And we've got our bounce height. Let's set the height limit. For the projectile. And of course, we're exposing these inside of the inspector so that we can adjust them as a designer. So the lifespan is set the time before we destroy object. Okay, so we've got a move speed, we've got a bounce height, a lifespan, and a bounce up. The next couple of things we need to think about is that we do want to find the position where we're actually hitting. So we hit a spot, and then we're going to be going from that spot how high up, and we're finding a difference between those 2 points. This allows us to have a little more control of the fireball. The direction that we're going to take with this isn't actually to create a physics object that actually bounces in the environment. We do want a little bit more control. And then from this example, you can take on using a material physics if you want to and make it much more of a physics-driven projectile. But for this one, we're going to do a very controlled code side type of action. So we have our lifespan. Let's go ahead and do a hit position so that we can find out when I hit inside of my trigger, where is that position. So we're going to do basically to store the location of the fireball when it hits something. And then we're going to move into our difference. We need to be able to store a variable so that we can find the difference between the current position and the hit position. And then we can find out whether or not we have gone beyond the height that we actually set. So we'll go in here and we'll just say a height difference. And the height difference we'll use as a float. And in this one, we are doing what? We're just getting the difference between the current position and the hit position. Okay, and then our next one, just so we don't skip it, we've got our bounce up, and the bounce up is, again, it's just setting the direction of the fireball. Okay, so this is going to give us probably everything we need. We may have to include something else, but this should get a good start for what we're going to do with the fireball. And then from here, let's start thinking about what we want to do for some of our functions. What type of functions do we need? We do need a function for the update because we are going to have to check for the position, the location of our fireball. So we need something that's constantly updating. We know we're also going to want to go in and set up a function for an on-trigger event because we want when this fireball to hit an object, once it hits this floor, we want to be able to check that yes, it's hit an object. We're going to store the position of that fireball, and then we're going to push that object back up in the opposite direction. And then when it gets up to a point that is the difference for our bounce height, then we're going to turn it to go back down inside of the scene. We're going to, in that way, create the illusion of the fireball bouncing. So what we want to do is also include inside of here for our function, we want a function on trigger enter. We're going to be using our other and collider here. This will work fine for us. And then the other one that we want from our functions is going to be its own function. We need to be able to kill the fireball. So let's go ahead and create a function for kill fireball. And we don't need to pass any information through. And then above the function update, let's go ahead and drop in a function start. This way we can actually start our fireball kill when the object is instantiated and have just a simple timer to count down the lifespan of the object. Okay, so these are going to be the functions that we're going to be dealing with. Let's go ahead and get started at actually filling these functions in. So we're going to start off simply by moving this object. And if we remember from before, we can just use our transform translate, and in that vector we can move it along an axis. So that's what we want to do. We just want to move this item. So let's do a transform. We're doing a dot translate. And inside of here we want to do what? We want to go in, we want to put a direction for this and the speed that we're going to be doing. Now this is going to be on the x-axis. We can see inside of the scene. It's going to be the x-axis. So we have a move speed, so let's use our move speed. And with our move speed, we're going to be multiplying this by what? We can multiply this by our time.delta time. And this is on our x. The next one is our y. We're going to keep this one at 0 for now. And 0 for the depth. We don't need a depth on it. Make sure we have a semicolon at the end of it. And if we hit save, and let's come back over into Unity. Let's take a look at the parent for our prefab here. And we do see that we have our variables inside. We have no issues inside of our console. So if we hit play, let's zoom out just a little bit. Okay, so our fireball is moving across the scene. So we have the first part of it. We've got it moving. The next thing we want to do is actually have it going down. So if we want it to go down, then we need to apply some sort of force to push it down. So that's going to be along the y-axis. So let's go in here. We're going to take our 0. We're going to say, well, this time we'll apply some sort of force to push it down. We could say maybe a 0.75. And we'll do time dot delta time. Yeah, let's see if we can spell that right. There we go. Okay, so we save that out. And we hit play. And there we go. We've now got it moving in a direction, right? There we go. Now, that seems like it's making the ball bounce up. So if we want it to bounce down, then we could put simply a negative to this, and that's going to push the ball in the opposite direction. Now, how do we know what direction it's going, and how do we set that up? Well, we need some sort of conditional. We need to say, you know, if our bounce up is false, then bounce bounce up with the ball. If the bounce up is true, then bounce down. So inside of our function update, let's set this up so that we can actually check for something. Let's put a conditional in here. We're going to simply say if bounce up, and if bounce up is what? If it's equal to true, then what are we going to do if it's equal to true? If it's equal to true, then that means that we want to have the ball bouncing up. And then else, we want the ball to actually bounce down. So let's say we go in here. We're just going to copy and paste some of what we've already got set up. And this time we're going to have the ball bouncing back down. I'm going to go ahead and set this at a speed that's a little bit more coming down. And of course these can be variables that we can bring out for bounce up speed, bounce down speed, so you can easily, adjust those inside the inspector. We're just going to leave them as a hard-coded value for right now. So I hit save. We'll go back up in here. And let's hit play. And as the object moves down, if we click bounce up, it's going to go back up. If we uncheck it, it starts moving. So let's zoom out just a little bit. Let's hit play one more time. And you can see how you can just check on your bounce up option. And you can imagine if we were going back and forth with this, we kind of create the illusion that this object is bouncing and create that same feeling that we have from the original Mario, where it was a little more static, not quite as dynamic of a bounce. Okay, so this gets us up and down. This is checking for our bounce up. The next thing we want to do inside of here is set for how high can we let this object go. So we're checking if it's set true, and we'll have to, check this or uncheck this within a trigger event. But what we want to do inside of here is say, well, how high are we going to allow this object to go? Well, the height difference is what we're going to be using. Our height difference is going to equal, and what's it going to equal? Well, it's simply going to equal our current position, so the current position of the fireball, minus the hit position. And the hit position is going to come up inside of our on trigger. We're going to say once I hit a spot, I trigger an event, I'm going to store that location, and that's the location I'm going to use when I'm subtracting from my current position. So our height difference is going to go from our transform dot position, and we'll do a dot y minus our hit position. And because we are so small here as far as the script is concerned, we're going to go ahead and just drop right down into our on trigger enter event, and we're simply going to just check for something. We're going to start off by simply saying, in the event that we actually have a trigger, let's just print something out. We're going to print other.name, so the name of whatever it is that we actually hit. There we go. You can see that it started off, it came down, and it started printing out the prefab tile to solid block. Okay. And that's letting us know that we are hitting something inside of the game, and that's a good thing for us. Now, the next thing that we want to do is we want to actually get the position where it hits. So instead of just printing out some information, let's actually get some information. Let's say our hit position equals something. So what do we want it to equal? We want it to equal our current transform position. So we'll say transform position dot y, and that way when we hit, we store that position, and that way when we feed this back in, we're feeding it back in based on the current position minus when it actually hit. That way we get the height difference, and then we can check for a height difference on an actual height. Okay, so that's storing that position for us. So moving up to our height difference, back into our update function, what we want to do is we want a conditional so that we can set the direction of our ball bouncing up or down. So we're going to be going in here and saying, well, if the bounce height, and that's how high we want to allow it to actually bounce, is less than or equal to the height difference, so you can see we're setting ourselves up so that the bounce height, the height difference, and if it's less than, then what do we want to do? Well, that basically means it's gone too high, so let's set the bounce up to a false. So let's go to our bounce up boolean, and we're going to say, well, that's going to equal false. And what does that do? Well, that unchecks this checkbox for us, so it sends it back down in the other direction for us. Now, on the onTrigger, it means that we did trigger an event. We grabbed our position, but then we also need to do one more thing. We need to actually tell it to go back up because it hit something. So we're going to say the bounce up equals true. So let's save those two out. Let's see what happens. We'll zoom out just a little bit. Let's move the ball over some. And we hit play. There we go. And you can see that it's looking for any kind of trigger event. As it moves across, we'll look at it one more time. It's bouncing up to a certain point. It's unchecking itself when it hits its limit from its current position up. And then it just kind of keeps on going. So here we've actually created that bouncing situation. And we're just doing that simply by unchecking and checking the direction of it and changing its position based on that. Okay, so with that set up, the next thing we can do is we can start checking for a little bit more about when I do hit something, what is that something I'm hitting? That way I make sure that I'm not just, I'm not bouncing off of Mario or bouncing off things that we don't want it to bounce off of. So for us, we want it to really just bounce off of the environment, just the blocks that are inside of the scene. So the simplest way to do that is just going back into our onTrigger event. We simply want to check for if I hit something, and let's just check for a tag. A tag is a great way to check for something. So we're going to say if, and what is the thing we're checking? It's the other object that we've collided with. We're saying if the other transform dot tag is equal to, and equal to what? Well, let's just do untagged, because we have a lot of objects inside of our scene, and one of the things that we haven't done is actually set a lot of our scene objects to a particular tag, which means they are untagged. We'll go ahead and close that one off. So let's take a quick look. If we look inside of our scene and we select on, let's say, some of the building blocks of the scene, most of the tags are all set to untagged. With the player, most of the player and objects inside of the scene have some sort of tag on them or no tag. So what we want to do is say, well, if it's untagged, then we'll use that one to actually collide with. The one thing, though, is to keep in mind that if we were going to work with this, we could actually set up tags to be a little more specific. You know, if the tag were water, then how is it going to behave? If the tag were a block or a bouncy block or a fire pit, is it going to do something different? So right in here is where we could actually set that up. We're checking for that tag, and then we're creating a behavior based on that tag. So for us, we're going to go in and we're going to just say untagged. If it's untagged, then we're going to bounce up, and the hit position is going to equal this. We'll go ahead and save that one out. We'll hit play. And we still get the same action. And we fall through inside of there. We must have something in here labeled. Aha! We've got a couple of here labeled as a block. So we can set those to an untagged. You can see how you could actually do a false box if you wanted to. Okay, so that gets us through setting up the basic part of the tag. Now the next thing we want to do is, let's say we have an item that we want it to explode on. For instance, if I'm coming in here, Control D, we're just simply going to make a copy of a couple of these. And then we'll move these guys over here. We just do a quick close test. If I have it going, you notice it's going to go right through that box. And why does it go through that box? Well, does it know to do anything different? Not really. It simply knows to go up. It simply knows to set the bounce direction. So what we want to do is we actually want to find a way to say, if there's something in front of this guy, let's make sure we destroy it. So if I'm bouncing and I hit a wall, it gets destroyed. We could set tags, set special collision boxes, and it makes it a little bit more difficult on the design side because you have to think about every single direction that you're working with. Or we could go in and say, well, let's cast a ray. Let's simply go in there and do a physics ray cast and see if there's something in front of me. And if there's something in front of me, then let's go ahead and destroy the object. So let's put that into our on trigger. We're going to go to our on trigger. We're simply going to say, let's set up our physics ray cast similar to what we did, if you remember, in your point and click game from one of the first labs. We're simply doing a ray cast. We're going to do a ray cast hit. And then inside of the ray cast hit, we're going to check for an if. Set up our conditional if our physics dot raycast. And what are we looking for inside of here? We're looking for our position. And just so we can see it, I'll keep it next to it so you can see. We're looking for our transform position. We're looking for vector 3. And inside of the vector 3, we're going to be looking for the direction. We'll say a 1, 0, 0. And as we continue on down, we've got our hit, which is our raycast hit. And then we've got our 0.1 for a distance. How far out are we actually looking? We don't want to have to start looking too far out. Now this is going to get us what? It's going to get us in the left direction or the right direction. And then we also want to check for the other direction. So we're going to have to check for a negative direction. So let's go and just copy and paste this. We're simply saying if we see something in front of us on the right hand side, or we see something in front of us on the left hand side, so we'll put a negative so that we see the left hand side. Then what do we want to do? Well, at that point we need to go in and we actually want to destroy the game object because we don't need it anymore to hit a wall. So we'll destroy our game object. And then we still need to handle our last part, so we'll just make an else. So we're saying else do this, which is to make it go back up and store the hit position. Alright, so let's check that out. We'll save that, then go back over, we'll hit play. It's going to bounce. Aha, and it got destroyed over there. Try it one more time. There we go. So we're looking where it bounces. When it runs into something that's to the side of it, then it gets destroyed. So a simple way to check for it. There's other ways we can approach it, but this is just one way that we're going to try for inside of this projectile. So let's real quickly go back through and set up a little bit of commenting in here so we know what we're actually doing. When we go back up here, the translate transform, we're simply moving the object. And we'll stretch this out a little bit so we're not back and forth. So we're moving our object for the up direction. Inside of here, for the height difference, we're simply getting where we hit and where we are. And then here we're simply just checking for have we reached the height. So did we go to, or let's say did we reach height limit. And then if we did reach it, send ball or send fireball back down. And if none of that's true, then that means that we simply want to move the object in the down direction. Okay, then we move on down to our onTrigger, and inside this onTrigger, we are going through and saying if the other transform tag is equal to untagged, which this is just for us to find out what exactly do we have set up for what it looks for. So this is going to be check for what to bounce on or what to collide with. Okay, so anything with an untagged, and of course like we said we can change that out. And we're storing our raycast hit here. We're checking for our collision with our ray, so we're gonna check for raycast hit. Left and right of the fireball. And you could also do maybe a physics sphere raycast if you wanted to. So if you're looking for trying to get a little bit larger on the object, if you do find that it goes through more often, you could do a sphere. Okay, so here we're simply going to destroy, move the object if it hits a wall. And then else, we're simply going to move the fireball up. And we're going to store the location where we hit. And this is really only the Y location. We're not storing a vector, just the Y variable. Okay, so this gets us formatted pretty good. This is getting us to bounce, it's getting us to check on the directions, and then we're moving into the function for our killing of the fireball. So let's go ahead and set that one up real quick. And this one is really straightforward. We simply want to put a time limit on it, so we simply can do our destroy game object. So we'll destroy our game object, and our second variable we can put in is a timer, so we can put in our lifespan. There's a semicolon on the end, and that way we control how long it lasts. Now, when do we need to call up this function? Well, we can call this one up when we actually create the fireball. So if we go up to our start function, we can just drop in our fireball, kill fireball right there, and that way the second this is instantiated, then it's going to start counting down, and as soon as it's done counting down, it's going to run that function and then destroy the object. Okay, let's save that. Let's double check. Let's make sure that we haven't got any type of errors. No errors in here. Let's hit play. Okay, and we're getting the object destroyed. Now the other thing we can do is set our timer. Let's make sure our timer is functioning right. The lifespan is there. Let's say 0.5 seconds instead, and 1, and it's gone. Okay, so that way we can easily set how long that object's going to last. And we'll apply that one out to the prefab. So we've got a lifespan set up on the object. We'll go back to our document. We've got a lifespan, we've got a bounce height, we've got a speed, and we're setting the direction of the object. So we're looking pretty good so far. One thing that we may want to do, and this is to set us up for one of the future items that we're going to create, which is the Goomba character, we do want to be able to check for an enemy object. So let's go in here and we're going to do an additional conditional statement. We're going to say if other.transform dot tag is equal to, and we're just going to say that our enemy Goomba is going to be tagged as enemy. So if we run across something in this scene that is tagged as enemy, then we're going to destroy it. And it's going to be destroying other game object. And then we're also going to have to remember we need to destroy our actual game object, the fireball. Okay. So if we run into an enemy, this is our quick, simple way of getting rid of the enemy and the fireball at the same time. So I'm going to save that one out. And let's go through here and let's just pretend that this guy is an enemy. So go into our enemy, we'll hit play, and let's make sure we can get a fireball that's going to last long enough. So let's set that up with at least 3 seconds. Hit play. And there we go. We got the fireball killing whatever has the tag enemy on it. Which would be fun too. You could destroy blocks if you wanted to. Have Mario be able to shoot through blocks and blow up some of the environment. Okay. Now the last thing we can do is actually instantiate some sort of smoke puff. You know, the fireball's coming in, it's hitting something, and we can have it create a puff of smoke at the same time. And we'll do that next. The last two things that we're going to do with this script are add a explosion to it. We want to add some sort of smoke puff to it when it actually hits an object. And we also want to tie off some of our player properties to make sure that when Mario shoots out this object, that it gets shot out in the right directions. Okay, so to finish off with the projectile fireball, we want to instantiate an object. We want to create that smoke puff. So the first thing we want to do is load up a smoke puff. So we'll say variable smoke puff, and we'll just load in a transform, and this is going to be load particle, and let's set this spelling up right. We'll load our particle, and let's go down to where we actually are killing this object, because where we're destroying it, that's basically where we want to get rid of it. So let's move into our destroy game object. If we actually run into an object right here, this is where we want to get rid of it. And then we also want to get rid of it if we run into what? Into an enemy. Now we could actually just create a function, and then in that function we could use that for each one of these. Or we can add instantiate to each one. The easiest way is function we'll do a particle play function. And then inside of the particle play, instantiate, and our instantiate is a fun little function that lets us bring up the object. And what do we want to bring up? That's the first part. What are we creating? We're creating the smoke puff. So we say, okay, we're going to instantiate our smoke puff. And then the next part of it's saying, where do we want to create it? Well, we're going to create it at its current transform position. So our transform dot position. And what's the rotation? Well, it's going to be our transform rotation. So this is what we're creating, this is where we're creating it, and that's good. And then we can just simply call up that particle play to create that object. Now we could also go in and do a little error checking, and we'll see that in just a second. Let's go ahead and drop this in up here. We'll say if it's an enemy, then we'll do our particle play function, which is simply going to instantiate that object for us. If we run into something and have to destroy the object, well, we're also going to go in there and do our particle play. And if we're going to kill the fireball at the very end, it goes poof before it goes out, then we're going to instantiate the object there. So let's save that one out. you can see how it's a little bit easier just to have that one function as opposed to writing and rewriting that line of code every time, especially if we're going to do any error checking. So let's go in, and we have our smoke puff option. Now if we just hit play, we haven't loaded anything in there, we immediately are going to get some errors. And the errors are going to say an unsigned referenced exception, which simply means I haven't actually assigned any object to here. And when I run through my code, I'm trying to create something that doesn't exist. So two things. One, you can always make sure that you have things loaded in here, or we can make sure that we have some error checking inside of here to handle that. So let's say we did some simple error checking. We're going to go in and just look for a simple conditional. If the smoke puff doesn't exist. So we're going to say if smoke puff is true. So if smoke puff is true, then create the object. Simple enough. And then we can say else, because we want to do a little debugging here. We'll do a debug log. And in here, we'll simply say object not loaded. And because we are creating this ourselves, we could say smoke particle not loaded. Be more specific. That way we know as the designer, oh yeah, I haven't put that effect into the game. Okay, and this way too, our code stays a little cleaner. We're not having error checking on every single one of them. We're simply running that one function which is checking for each one of those. Alright, let's go back over. Let's clear our console. Let's hit play. And this time around we're bouncing, but it's not saying anything other than the error message that we want, which is smoke particle not loaded. As the designer, you can go in and go, oh yeah, let's go in there and assign some sort of smoke particle. We probably have at least one in here that we can use, our prefab particle smoke. I would suggest making, for the fun of a nice little white puffy smoke particle just specifically for this one. And poof, we got our little particle smoke right in there. Alright, we're looking good. And that's going to tie off our fireball. Of course, the last thing you can add to this is the audio. So you can go in and add the audio play and actually play that sound when it hits and drop that into each one of the functions where you need it. The last part that we want to check on for the fireballs, we actually want to assign this to Mario, and we want Mario to use it. I'm going to apply this, make sure it's back out on our main prefab. I'm going to get rid of these blocks. And let's take a look at Mario real quick. Mario is going to be going left and right. We're checking for the direction. So let's look at Mario. What do we have in Mario? Mario, we have our projectile fireball, and we need to make sure that we've got that loaded up. So if you don't have that loaded in there, you just want to find your prefab fireball, drag and drop that into the inspector slot for the fireball. And then what we want to do is check on our player properties. So we're going to go to our player properties script. And in our player properties script, we have a section right down below, just a little bit inside of the update function. And what we're looking at changing, we've got two sets that we're going to change. We have the clone rigid body add force that's there right now. And we're not going to be doing it with a rigid body. We're simply just going to be doing it by the move speed. So we can comment this out, and in case you want to go in there and you want to do it by an actual physics material, then you could go in there and add the rigid body, add force, and then push it in a direction. But for us, we're simply going to do it by clone get component. And what component are we getting? Well, we're getting the projectile fireball, and that's going to be this script right here. We're getting an instance of that script. And then what are we doing? Well, we're checking on the move speed. We're going to set the move speed to a -2. That way, we can say, well, if my direction is right or if my direction is left, then I can change the move speed to set the direction of the fireball to be the right direction. So what we want to do, we're changing this line and we're changing this line. And by changing both of those lines, we get them set up and ready so that we can actually have that object go out in the right direction. And with that done, let's go ahead and go back in. Let's look at Mario. Let's see if we can get him to shoot. There we go. Now we're going to notice that the fireball kind of goes up. And why do you think it goes up? Well, and this is where we do a little bit of debugging. We go, something doesn't seem quite right. Well, we'll notice on Mario, we've got lots of collision boxes around him. Now, we want to find out, are all the collision boxes actually set to a specific tag? Because if we think back to our fireball, well, we just left it with untagged. And untagged does what? Untagged simply sets it going up in a direction, so it goes up. Well, if we look at our boxes, well, our first box has a tag for the body, for the feet, for the head. The focal point is way out in the distance, and then our socket, left, and our socket right. So it's actually colliding with those and setting the direction up instead of straight down. So we can just do a real quick changeover. We could just set that to really anything other than untagged. We'll go in and set this to maybe the body, and we could set these to more specific. We could do projectile tags on each one. But just so we can test it, we'll go in, we'll say great, and we shoot, and this time the fireball goes flying down towards the ground. And if we jump up in the air and shoot, everything works just like it's supposed to. Alright, so Mario is now ready to take on his environment with a fireball. Hope you enjoyed it.